The envelope hit the table between them like a gunshot. Lydia Barrett stood in the doorway of the Ford Ranch house, her black mourning dress still dusted from 3 days of hard riding, her jaw set against the trembling she refused to let show. The afternoon sun poured in behind her like an accusation, and she did not step fully inside, because stepping inside felt too much like surrender. Micah Ford had not moved from his chair. He sat behind the heavy oak desk that dominated the front room, his dark eyes watching her with an expression she could not read, and that unreadability terrified her more than any anger would have. She had prepared herself for anger. She had rehearsed what she would say to rage, to contempt, to the satisfaction some creditors wore when a debtor's widow appeared at their door. She had not prepared herself for stillness. $340, she said. Her voice came out cleaner than she expected. That is what my husband, Thomas Barrett, borrowed from you in the spring of 1881. I have the receipts he kept. I know the exact figure. I have brought $220 in cash and a bill of sale for my mare, Clara, which is worth no less than $130 at market in Abilene. That covers the principal and then some. I expect no forgiveness on the interest, Mr. Ford. I am here to settle the debt, and I intend to settle it fully. Micah Ford looked at the envelope on the table for a long moment. Then he looked at her. Then he stood slowly, the way tall men who have been still for a long time tend to do, unfolding himself from the chair as if the act cost him something. He was broader than she remembered from the one time she had seen him, at a church social in Caldwell 3 years before Thomas had introduced them briefly. He was sun-darkened and serious-looking, with a jaw that appeared to have been carved from the same limestone that jutted out of the Kansas plains. He did not touch the envelope. "Mrs. Barrett," he said, "there is no debt." The words hit her like a slap she had not anticipated, not because they were cruel but because they weren't, because his voice was entirely, devastatingly calm. "I beg your pardon," she said. "Your husband's debt was forgiven, 6 months before he died." He finally looked away from her down at the desk as if something written there required his attention, though there was nothing written there. "I canceled it in writing. I sent the letter to your address in Caldwell. I assumed you knew." Lydia felt the floor shift beneath her feet, and she gripped the door frame without meaning to. 3 months ago, Thomas had died of a fever in the bedroom she had nursed him in for 11 days. She had held his hand at the end. She had buried him in the churchyard beside the oak tree he had always said gave the best shade in the county. And then she had gone through every paper he owned, searching for the extent of the damage he had left behind, because Thomas Barrett, God rest him, had left behind a great deal of damage. "I never received any letter," she said. Micah Ford looked at her again, and this time what crossed his face was something she was not prepared to name. "Then we have a problem," he said, "because I meant what I sent. Sit down, Mrs. Barrett, please. You look like you have not slept since Caldwell." She had not slept since Caldwell. She sat. The story of how Lydia Calhoun had become Lydia Barrett was not, by any measure, a romantic one. She had been 23 years old and newly arrived in Caldwell, Kansas, in the autumn of 1879, having come west from Cincinnati with her father, a pharmacist whose lungs had given out in the damp Ohio winters, and who had been told dry plains air might extend his life by years. The dry plains air had not extended his life by much. He had lasted 18 months in Caldwell before the same tuberculosis that had driven him from Cincinnati caught up with him in the Kansas territory, as if the disease had simply needed time to pack its bags and follow. Lydia had been left alone in a territory she barely understood, with a small stock of pharmaceutical supplies, a rented room above the general store, and a working knowledge of chemistry that was considered eccentric for a woman but had thus far kept her employed as an assistant to the town's doctor, a perpetually exhausted man named Haller who appreciated that she could read a medical text without spelling out the words. Thomas Barrett had come into the doctor's office in the spring of 1880 with a broken wrist he had sustained falling from a fence he had been too proud to admit he couldn't handle, and he had been charming about it. Thomas was always charming. He had warm brown eyes and a quick laugh, and a particular talent for making whoever he was talking to feel like the most important person in any room. He had proposed to Lydia Barrett 6 weeks after meeting her, which was extremely fast, and which she, lonely and frightened and 24 years old in a place that did not fully feel like home, had accepted before she had thought too carefully about what she was accepting. She did not regret Thomas. It was important, she thought, to be honest with herself about that. She had loved him in her fashion, and he had been kind to her in his fashion, and they had made something functional and sometimes warm out of their marriage for 3 years. But Thomas Barrett had also been a man who could not resist a deal, particularly a bad one, and who had an absolute genius for borrowing money he had not yet figured out how to repay. By the time the fever took him in January of 1883, he owed money to 6 different men across 2 counties, and Lydia had spent the weeks following his burial doing the grim arithmetic of exactly how precarious her position had become. The debt to Micah Ford had been the largest single item on the list. $340 was not an insignificant sum in 1883. It was more than most men made in 4 months of solid labor. Thomas had borrowed it, as far as Lydia could reconstruct from the receipts she had found, to purchase breeding stock for a cattle operation he had been convinced would turn their fortunes around. The cattle had done poorly. The operation had collapsed within a year. The debt had remained. She had not sold her mare lightly. Clara was a 7-year-old bay with a white star on her forehead, and the steadiest temperament Lydia had ever encountered in a horse, which was saying something given that Lydia had spent 3 years in the Kansas territory, where horses were tested by weather that seemed personally offended by their existence. She had ridden Clara for 240 miles to reach the Ford Ranch, which was located outside a small settlement called Parsons in Labette County, southeast of Caldwell, and the mare had carried her the entire way without complaint. Selling Clara felt like betrayal, but a debt was a debt, and Lydia Barrett was not her husband. She paid what she owed, or she had intended to. Micah Ford had set a pot of coffee on the iron stove that occupied one corner of the front room, and the smell of it was so ordinary and domestic against the extraordinary strangeness of the conversation they were having that Lydia found herself watching the pot with something close to gratitude for its normalcy. "He came to me in September," Micah said, his back to her as he checked the coffee. "Your husband. He rode out here unannounced, which was not unusual for Thomas. We had known each other since we were boys. Did you know that?" "He mentioned you," Lydia said carefully. "He said you were from the same part of Missouri, Laclede County. We grew up within 10 miles of each other." Micah paused. "I came west in 1875. Thomas followed a few years later. We weren't close by the time we both landed in Kansas, but we weren't strangers either. When he came to me asking for money in the spring of 1881, I lent it because I thought I knew who he was. And by September of 1882, you no longer thought that." He turned to look at her then, and his expression was careful in a way that told her he was choosing his words. "He came to me in September because he knew he was sick. He didn't tell me how sick, but I could see it. He wanted to discuss the debt. He wanted to know if I would allow Lydia, he called you Lydia, he wanted to know if I would allow you to pay it back over time in installments, because he was worried about what would happen to you." Lydia felt something tighten in her chest that had nothing to do with money. "He was worried about you," Micah said again, and this time his voice was quieter. "He sat in that chair you're sitting in now and he talked about you for an hour. He told me you were the most capable person he had ever known, and that he had not done right by you, and that he was sorry for it, and that he needed to know someone would give you time and space to manage things." He poured 2 cups of coffee and set one in front of her. "I told him I would do better than that. I told him the debt was forgiven. I wrote the letter myself that same evening." Lydia looked at the coffee. She did not pick it up immediately. She was afraid that if she moved, something inside her would crack in a way she could not control in front of a stranger. "Why?" she said. Her voice was very quiet. Micah sat down across from her. He wrapped both hands around his cup. Outside, she could hear the distant sound of cattle and the wind moving through what sounded like a great deal of open land. Because he was a man who owed a lot of people, a lot of things he couldn't repay, Micah said. And because you were not him. And because $340 was not worth watching a woman I had never properly met lose everything because her husband had made bad decisions. He paused. I know how that can happen. I've watched it happen. There was something in those last words that carried weight, something personal and dark and not entirely explained. Lydia noticed it but didn't press it. She was too busy trying to hold herself together. The letter never arrived, she said. I sent it to the address Thomas gave me, a boarding house on Merchant Street. We moved in November. She closed her eyes briefly. He didn't tell me. He didn't tell me a great deal of things. She opened them again and looked at Micah Ford directly. I cannot accept the forgiveness, Mr. Ford. I know you mean well and I understand your reasoning, but I am not a charity case and I will not be treated as one. I have the money. I have the bill of sale. Take the money. He looked at her for a long moment and she could see him thinking, could see something moving behind those dark eyes that was not impatience and not condescension, and was therefore frustrating in a way she had not anticipated. What if I hired you instead? He said. She blinked. I beg your pardon. What are you doing now after Caldwell? What is the plan? I have not made a plan yet, she said stiffly. I have only just buried my husband. And you rode 240 miles to repay a debt you didn't have to repay. That is correct. So you're organized under pressure, he said. And you're willing to do things that are hard. He leaned back in his chair. I have a problem, Mrs. Barrett. I run this ranch with a crew of 6 men and 1 cook, and my cook left 2 weeks ago for Wichita because his brother needed him. I'm feeding 6 working men on my own skills, which are considerably less than adequate. I also keep the books for the ranch myself, and I am increasingly behind on them because I am spending too much time in the kitchen. I need someone who can manage a household and keep accounts. I'm willing to pay $7 a month plus room and board, which is fair wages for a housekeeper in this territory. Lydia stared at him. You are offering me employment. I am offering you a solution to 2 problems at once, he said. Mine and yours. If you're determined to feel like you've worked off the debt, fine. I'll keep track of your wages against whatever figure you have in your head, and you can tell me when you feel the account is settled. After that you can stay on at wages or leave, whichever suits you. The thing that frightened her most about this offer was how reasonable it was. She had in fact no clear plan for after Caldwell. She had the $220 in cash, which was most of what she had left after paying the other creditors, and she had no property and no family and no particularly strong attachment to any location in the territory. She was 27 years old and she had a set of skills she was not sure mapped neatly onto any single obvious path. I would need to keep my mare, she said. Of course. And I would need my own room. Private? There is a room off the kitchen that has not been used since my sister visited 2 years ago. It has a good lock on the door. You have a sister. In Denver. She visits irregularly. He drank his coffee without taking his eyes off her. She would probably like you. She also argues with things she could just accept. Lydia Barrett looked at the envelope with its $220 and its bill of sale for a mare she did not want to sell. And she looked at the man across from her who was offering her something that was not quite charity and not quite a simple transaction, and was something she did not yet have a category for. And she made the decision the way she had made most important decisions in her life, quickly and quietly, before the fear could catch up. 1 month trial, she said. If either of us finds it unsuitable, the arrangement ends without complication. Agreed, said Micah Ford. She did not give him the envelope. She put it back in her traveling bag, and she picked up the coffee cup and drank from it, and it was very good coffee, which she considered a reasonable beginning. The Ford Ranch occupied approximately 800 acres of Labette County in southeastern Kansas, which in the spring of 1883 was country that could not decide if it was prairie or timber land. and had settled on being both simultaneously in a way that was occasionally beautiful and frequently inconvenient. Micah ran primarily longhorn cattle with a small herd of mixed breeds he was experimenting with, and he had a kitchen garden that had been thoroughly ignored for the past 2 weeks, and which Lydia discovered in a state of somewhat desperate overgrowth on her second morning. She attacked it the way she attacked most problems, methodically and without complaint, and the 6 ranch hands watched her do so from a careful distance that suggested they had already received some instruction from their employer about minding their business. The hands were, in order of the way she met them, Pete Garza, who was the foreman and a man of about 40 with a weathered face and the kind of quiet authority that didn't need to announce itself. Young Danny Rourke, who was 19 and possessed of a persistent blush that appeared whenever anyone addressed him directly. The brothers Cal and Willis Hatch, who were in their late 20s and communicated primarily through a private language of half-sentences and meaningful looks. A man who went by Crockett, whose actual surname Lydia did not learn for 2 weeks because everyone called him Crockett without further specification. And finally, an older man named Amos who had worked on the Ford ranch since before Micah had owned it, and who treated the land with a reverence that Lydia recognized as the deepest kind of loyalty. Micah's house was solid and well built, constructed of timber and fieldstone in a style that suggested someone had been thinking about permanence when they designed it, which turned out to be Micah himself, who had built the main structure over a period of 3 years in the late 1870s, with help from neighbors and occasional hired labor. There were 4 rooms on the ground floor, including the front room that served as office and sitting room, a proper kitchen, a dining room that connected to the kitchen, and the small room with the good lock on the door that became Lydia's. Upstairs there were 2 bedrooms and a study that Micah used for reading. She learned the house the way she had always learned new environments, through careful observation and systematic exploration, noting where things were kept and what was missing and what could be improved. The kitchen was well supplied with tools but poorly organized, with cast iron pans stacked in precarious towers and dry goods stored in no particular order, and a flour bin that had not been properly sealed and had attracted insects. She reorganized it on her first full day, which took most of the morning, and when she produced supper that evening from the ingredients available, which was a beef and vegetable stew over cornbread, Pete Garza said it was the best meal he had eaten since his mother's kitchen in San Antonio, and she could see the other men trying not to agree too enthusiastically, because they were working cowboys and not in the habit of admitting things affected them. Micah sat at the head of the table and ate without comment for most of the meal, which she had already identified as his way. He was not cold, he was not unfriendly. He was simply a man who had learned to keep a great deal behind his eyes, and she recognized that because she did the same thing. After the hands returned to the bunkhouse and she was clearing the supper dishes, he came into the kitchen with his coffee cup and said simply, "Thank you." "It's what I'm here for," she said. "Yes," he said. "But thank you anyway." She looked at him then briefly, and he was looking back at her with an expression that was straightforward and without calculation, and she thought, "This is a man who means what he says." It was such an unusual thing to recognize in a person that she was still thinking about it when she went to bed. The accounts were in a state that she would charitably describe as creative. Micah kept his ledgers in a hand that was clear and even but organized according to a system that appeared to have developed organically over time and had accumulated categories and subcategories that were only partially related to each other. The ranch's income from cattle sales was meticulously recorded. The expenses were considerably less so. She spent her 3rd and 4th days at the ranch going through the books from the beginning of the calendar year, reconstructing the actual financial picture, and the picture, when fully assembled, was interesting. The Ford ranch was profitable, genuinely profitable in a way that surprised her given the state of the accounts. Micah had an instinct for cattle that translated into consistently good sale prices, and his operating costs were kept low through a combination of careful management, and the fact that several of his hands, Pete Garza in particular, had been with him long enough to work with a minimum of waste. But there were also patterns in the expenses that told a story: quiet donations to the settlement's small school, a consistent monthly payment to a family in Parsons named Whitfield who she had no other information about, medical expenses for ranch hands that went beyond what most employers would cover. She noted these things without mentioning them. They were not her business. But they told her something about the man whose books she was keeping, and she filed that knowledge away with the careful attention she gave to everything that might eventually be important. On the fifth day, a man named Harlan Doyle rode onto the Ford ranch, and that was when Lydia first understood that not everything about Micah Ford's life was as peaceful as the mornings felt. She was in the kitchen garden when Doyle arrived, and she saw him from a distance, a heavy-set man on a gray horse with two other men behind him, and she could read the body language of the encounter from 30 yards away, because it was the body language of a confrontation that had happened before. Micah came out of the barn and stood in the yard to meet them, and Pete Garza appeared from the direction of the pasture with the particular casualness of a man who has decided to be conveniently nearby. She could not hear the conversation clearly at that distance, but she could see that Doyle was talking and Micah was listening without the expression of a man who intended to agree with what he was hearing. After approximately 10 minutes, Doyle and his men rode back down the track toward the main road, and Micah stood watching them go until they were out of sight. That evening, when the hands had gone to the bunkhouse and she was sitting at the kitchen table finishing the books by lamplight, she heard him come in and stop in the kitchen doorway. She did not look up. "I apologize if that was alarming," he said. "The men who came today, I should have said something about them earlier." "You don't owe me an explanation," she said. She wrote a figure in the ledger. "But if you want to give one, I'm listening." He sat down across from her at the table, which was becoming, she was noticing, where both of them ended up when there was something that needed to be said. The kitchen table had a quality of honest practicality that seemed to suit them both better than more formal settings. "Harlan Doyle owns the parcel of land east of mine," Micah said. "He's wanted to buy my water rights for 3 years. The creek that runs through the northeast corner of this property is the only reliable water source in a 3-mile radius, and I have the senior claim on it. Without access to my water rights, Doyle's ability to expand his operation is limited. And you won't sell. It is not that simple." He was quiet for a moment. "The family Doyle wants to push out is the Whitfields. They homesteaded 30 acres between my property and Doyle's 7 years ago. If Doyle controls the water rights, they lose access to water for their crops and their animals, and they lose their farm. Martha Whitfield is 52 years old and has been on that land since before her husband died. Her son is 15 and works the farm with her." He paused. "I won't sell the rights to a man who will use them to destroy his neighbors." Lydia looked up from the ledger then. She thought of the monthly payments to the Whitfields in the account she had spent 2 days reconstructing. The payments made a different kind of sense now. "He will not stop asking," she said. "No," Micah agreed. "He won't. He's the kind of man who treats patience as strategy." Something moved through his expression that was old and cold. "I know the type." She wanted to ask what had made him know the type so well, what dark past had given him that particular fluency. She did not ask because she recognized the wall when she saw it, having several of her own. "The accounts are in better shape than you thought," she said instead, returning to the ledger. "You're profitable. You have room to sustain a long legal fight over water rights if it comes to that." He looked at her sharply. "I hadn't considered the legal route. The territorial courts have been ruling on water rights disputes for years," she said. "My father used to subscribe to the Territorial Gazette. I read everything he brought home. Prior appropriation doctrine. You filed your water claim first, and there should be documentation of that filing that could be used to establish your superior right." She met his eyes. "I'm not a lawyer, but I know how to read, And I know what the law says, and it says you have options beyond simply refusing and waiting for things to get worse." Micah Ford looked at her for a long moment with an expression that she was beginning to recognize as the one he wore when something had surprised him in a way he found pleasant rather than threatening. "I'll write to the county seat tomorrow," he said, "see who I can consult with." "I can draft the letter," she said. "If you'd like, I have legible handwriting and I know what information should be included." "Yes," he said, "I would like that." He stood to go, then paused. "Mrs. Barrett, for the books. You don't have to work until this hour on my account." "I like the quiet," she said. It was true. The late evenings when the lamp was low, and the house settled around her with all the small sounds of a building that had been lived in for years, were some of her favorite moments in a life that had not had many purely peaceful ones. He looked at her for another moment with that same expression, and then he said good night and went upstairs, and she listened to his footsteps on the stairs and the floor above her until they went quiet, and then she went back to the books, and she was still smiling slightly in a way she did not fully acknowledge to herself. The letter to the county seat produced results faster than either of them had anticipated, largely because Micah Ford had, as it turned out, filed his water claim in 1876, and the documentation was both clear and complete, and the county's records confirmed prior appropriation in terms that left very little room for ambiguity. A lawyer in Independence named Carmichael wrote back within 3 weeks to say that Doyle would have an extremely difficult time making any legal argument for forced sale of the water rights, and that if Doyle attempted to interfere with the Whitfields' water access, he would be exposing himself to significant legal liability. Micah rode to see Martha Whitfield with the letter in his coat pocket, and he came back in the late afternoon looking like a man who had put something down that he had been carrying for longer than was comfortable. Lydia was in the kitchen garden when he rode in. She heard him unsaddle his horse in the barn, and she heard him cross the yard, and when she looked up, he was walking toward her in the late afternoon light with his hat in his hand, and a look on his face that was the most open she had seen it. "She cried," he said. "Martha Whitfield. She told me to tell you thank you. She knows you're the one who found the legal angle." "I only read," Lydia said. "You were the one who filed the claim properly 7 years ago and kept the paperwork. Didn't know the paperwork would matter until you told me it might." He stood at the edge of the garden, turning his hat in his hands. "She wants to have you for supper. Martha Whitfield. She's a good cook and she's lonely and she wants to thank you properly." Something about this request, its ordinariness, its assumption that she was someone who received dinner invitations and had a social life in this community, caught Lydia off guard in a way she did not expect. She had been in Parsons for less than 3 weeks. She was not from here. She was a widow keeping house for a rancher in a territory that was not hers by origin, and yet the invitation felt like an offer of belonging that she did not know what to do with. "That would be very kind," she said carefully. "I'll take you Sunday," Micah said, "if you're willing to ride." "I have my own horse," she said, and heard the slight tartness in her voice that crept in when she was trying to maintain a distance she was no longer sure she wanted. He heard it too, she could tell, but he only smiled slightly, the first real smile she had seen from him, and said, "Yes, you do," and went inside, and she stood in the kitchen garden for another full minute before she remembered what she had been doing. Martha Whitfield was a small, iron-haired woman with hands that showed 30 years of hard work and eyes that missed absolutely nothing. She lived with her son, Jacob, in a well-tended house that was smaller than Micah's but equally solid, and she received them on a Sunday in late April with a meal that demonstrated clearly that Pete Garza had been right about the quality of his mother's cooking in San Antonio, because this was the second-best meal Lydia had eaten in Kansas, and it was being served by a 52-year-old widow on a 30-acre homestead. Jacob Whitfield was 15 and intensely shy, which manifested as a studied attention to the food on his plate whenever anyone addressed him, but he listened with great care to everything that was said around him, and occasionally raised his eyes to check whether the adults were still being serious. He reminded Lydia of herself at 15, which was not something she said aloud. After supper, while Jacob did the washing up with the resignation of a boy who had learned to accept his domestic responsibilities, Martha walked with Lydia and Micah out to the porch, and the three of them stood watching the prairie light go golden over the fields. "You two make good sense together," Martha said, with the directness of a woman who had been on the frontier long enough to regard social niceties as a luxury, like extra firewood. "You used them when you had them and you did without when you didn't." Lydia felt color come into her face and looked deliberately at the horizon. Micah said, "Mrs. Whitfield," in a tone that was gently remonstrative. "I'm not being improper," Martha said. "I'm being observant. You've been out here alone too long, Micah Ford, and this woman has clearly had nobody looking out for her interests for quite some time, and you both know it, even if you're going to pretend you don't, because you've only known each other 3 weeks and propriety says you should pretend for at least 3 months." She paused. "I respect propriety as much as the next woman. I just think it's worth naming what's true." Lydia and Micah did not look at each other on the ride home. They rode side by side in the purple dusk, Clara keeping easy pace with Micah's gelding, and they talked about Martha's garden and the state of the spring planting, and whether the creek level was likely to stay consistent through the summer. And they talked about all of these things very carefully, and said none of the things that Martha Whitfield had been too direct not to name. But Lydia was aware of him in a way she had been aware of very few people in her life. Aware of the specific gravity of him, the way the air felt different in whatever portion of it he occupied. And when they reached the ranch and he helped her down from the saddle, because the fence post she usually used to mount and dismount was on the far side of the barn, his hands were at her waist briefly and then gone, and the briefly was a thing she felt for a very long time afterward. It was the accounts that cracked it open in the end, or rather, what she found in the accounts that she had not been meant to find. She was going through the ledgers from previous years, organizing them for storage, when she found a separate record book tucked inside a larger ledger, clearly separate, not hidden exactly but not prominent either. It was a list of names and amounts, spanning 6 years, the years from 1877 to 1882, and the names were all women, widows, she would discover later, and families in difficult circumstances, and a homesteader's family whose name she recognized from a newspaper account of a fire in 1880 that had destroyed their barn and winter supplies. Against each name was an amount and a date, and the amounts were not small. She sat with the record book open in front of her for a long time, and then she closed it and put it back exactly where she had found it, because it was not her business. But what it told her about Micah Ford was not something she could unknow. It told her that the monthly payment to Martha Whitfield was not an isolated act. It told her that the forgiveness of Thomas Barrett's debt had not been an isolated act. It told her that this man had been quietly and systematically doing this for 6 years without any apparent need for recognition, because none of the names in that book had any corresponding note about being told who had helped them. She was still sitting very still at the kitchen table when she heard his boots on the stairs, and she stood and moved to the stove to check the coffee because she needed something to do with her hands. He appeared in the kitchen doorway and stopped. "You found it," he said. She turned to face him. "I wasn't looking. It was inside the 1879 ledger." "I know." He came in and sat at the table without being invited, which he had never done before, and the fact that he sat without ceremony told her that the moment felt different to both of them. "I should have moved it to the study. I forgot it was there." "It's none of my business," she said. "No," he agreed, "but since you've seen it." She turned back to the stove and poured 2 cups of coffee and carried them to the table and sat across from him, and she looked at him directly and said, "Why?" He was quiet for a moment. She waited because she had learned that he spoke when he was ready and not before, and pressing him produced politeness but not truth. "My mother," he said finally. "She was left with 4 children and a farm and no money when my father died. I was the eldest. I was 12. We had neighbors who helped us quietly, without making it feel like charity. And that help was what kept us on that land for the next 6 years, until I was old enough to work wages that actually sustained us. Without those neighbors, my mother would have lost everything. She almost did anyway. He paused. I never forgot what it felt like to be on that side of things. And when I started doing well enough that I had something to spare, I thought about those neighbors. I thought about what it cost them to help us. I don't think it cost them very much in the end. I think helping is mostly something people do when they decide the other person's difficulty matters. Lydia looked at the coffee cup. She was doing that thing again, being very careful not to move, because something was building in her chest that was both very old and very new simultaneously. You never tell them, she said. The people in that book, you never tell them it was you. Sometimes they know, sometimes they don't. He wrapped his hands around his cup. It doesn't matter. It matters to them, she said. It would have mattered to me. When I was 19 and my father was sick and I didn't know how we were going to pay for his medicine, she stopped. Someone left money with the pharmacist, just left it anonymously twice. Enough for a month's treatment both times. I never knew who it was. I still think about it. I don't know who that was, Micah said carefully, in case you're wondering. I know, she said. You were in Kansas in 1880. Yes. A silence settled between them that was not uncomfortable. The lamp flickered slightly in a draft from somewhere, and the ranch house made its small settling sounds. And outside the night was clear and enormous the way Kansas nights were enormous, as if the sky had decided to be as large as possible to compensate for the flatness of the land beneath it. Thomas was right, Micah said quietly. She looked at him. He said you were the most capable person he had ever known, Micah said. He was right about that. He was also right that he hadn't done right by you. A pause, and something in his jaw tightened slightly. I was angry with him when he told me that. He said it like he was confessing it, and I thought, if you know you haven't done right by her, why hasn't the knowledge changed anything? But I also thought people don't always know how to change, even when they know they should. Thomas was good in his way, Lydia said. He just didn't have much discipline about keeping his intentions and his actions aligned. No, Micah said. He didn't. You do, she said. And then, because that had come out too directly, she added, it's apparent from the accounts. He looked at her with a slight expression that suggested he knew perfectly well she had not meant the accounts, but he was too kind to press her on it. Go to bed, he said gently. You've been up since before sunrise. She had been. She went. She did not sleep for a long time. May came and brought heat and a long dry spell that worried the hands and kept Micah up at night checking the creek level and the cattle, and doing the mental calculations of a man who understood that land was both generous and completely indifferent to human need. Lydia watched him carry the worry with a steadiness she found simultaneously admirable and frustrating, because she wanted to help, and the help he needed was not the kind she could provide through better bookkeeping or a well-organized kitchen. What she could do was be present. She brought coffee to the barn at odd hours without being asked. She kept supper ready late on evenings when he was still with the herd. She sat on the porch in the evenings when the heat made the house stuffy, and he joined her sometimes, and they talked about nothing in particular: the progress of the creek, the behavior of the cattle, the news from the Territorial Gazette, and gradually the nothing in particular accumulated into the kind of history that people who share space build without exactly deciding to. She told him about Cincinnati. She had not talked about Cincinnati since leaving it, not because it was a painful place, because it was not, but because it had felt so far from everything she was now that it seemed irrelevant. But she told him about the river and the green hills, and the particular way summer felt in Ohio, heavy and warm with the smell of the river. And she told him about her father's pharmacy on Vine Street, and the books she had read there while her father compounded prescriptions, and the way she had spent her childhood understanding chemistry before she understood anything else about the world. You should have been a doctor, he said. They were on the porch. The stars were very bright because there was no moon and the sky was entirely clear, or a pharmacist yourself. In 1883, that is more easily said than accomplished, she said. That's true, he said, but not forever. Perhaps not forever, she agreed. He looked at her sideways in the darkness. What do you want, Lydia? Not what is practical. What do you want? It was the first time he had used her given name. She noticed it the way you notice a change in the quality of light in a room, not because it is dramatic, but because it is exactly right. She thought about the question seriously, the way she thought about everything serious. I want to matter, she said, not in a grand sense. I don't need to be famous or particularly significant. I want to be in a place where what I do makes a difference that can be seen. I want to be in a place that is mine. I want to not feel like a guest in my own life. She paused. I've felt like that for a long time, since before Thomas, really. Since my father got sick and I understood that the life I had imagined was not going to be the one I lived. He was very quiet for a moment. This is not a guest's life, he said carefully. What you're doing here, what you've built in 2 months. I know, she said. I know that and I'm grateful for it, but it is still your life, Micah. Your ranch and your accounts and your supper table. I'm in it, but it isn't mine. The silence that followed had a different quality than the earlier ones. He was thinking, she could tell, thinking carefully and at some length, and she let him, because she had said what she meant and she did not regret it and she did not want to soften it into something less honest. What would it take, he said finally, for it to be yours? Her heart did something it had not done since she was a very young woman with very different expectations. She did not answer the question immediately. She looked at the stars, and she listened to the ranch around her, and she thought about Thomas Barrett and his warm eyes, and his talent for making people feel important, and his chronic failure to do the hard things he promised himself he would do. And she thought about what it meant to be standing at 37 months of widowhood, talking to a man who did the hard things without being asked, and who forgave debts he did not have to forgive, and who had spent 6 years quietly keeping a list of people who needed help and helping them without needing credit for it. I don't know, she said honestly. I think I'm still finding out. He nodded, as if that were the precise right answer, and they sat on the porch until the stars began to fade at the edges, and neither of them said anything more, and it was enough. It was Harlan Doyle who forced the issue, as men like Harlan Doyle tend to do. In June, with the dry spell finally broken by 3 days of good rain and the creek running clear and strong again, Doyle came to the Ford ranch not with 2 men but with 5, and the nature of the visit had changed in a way that Lydia recognized from the kitchen window before she had any actual information. She went to find Pete Garza, who was in the barn mending tack, and she said quietly, "Doyle is in the yard with 5 men." "Where is Micah?" Pete Garza was on his feet before she finished the sentence, and he went out the barn side door without rushing but also without hesitation, and she saw him collecting Cal and Willis Hatch from the pasture fence as he crossed the yard, and she understood that the casual triangulation was deliberate and practiced, and that whatever Harlan Doyle was saying to Micah, he was now saying it with the awareness that the numbers had shifted. She stayed inside because going outside would not help and might make things worse. She watched from the window. Doyle was doing most of the talking. Micah was doing what Micah did, which was standing very still and listening without any sign that the words were penetrating, and she had learned by now that this stillness was not passivity. It was the stillness of a man who had decided not to move and would not be moved by volume alone. After 20 minutes, Doyle left. He went slowly, which was its own kind of threat, the threat of a man who is not done and wants you to know it. Micah came inside to find Lydia at the kitchen table with the county water rights documentation spread in front of her. "He's threatening legal action," he said. He sounded more tired than frightened. "On what grounds?" "He claims there's a discrepancy in my original filing that invalidates the senior claim. He has a lawyer in Topeka who apparently is willing to make that argument." He sat down and rubbed his face with both hands. "I don't know if it holds any legal water." The pun was not intentional. "But it will cost money to defend and time I don't have, and it is precisely the kind of sustained pressure that wears a man down until he agrees to things he shouldn't agree to just to make the pressure stop. Then we make the defense efficient, Lydia said. She had already been reading the documentation. Your original filing is dated March 14, 1876. The creek is named specifically in the filing, described with boundary markers that match your current fence lines. The filing was witnessed by 2 county officials whose names are recorded. She spread the papers further. Whatever discrepancy Doyle's lawyer thinks he's found, it is not in the original document because the original document is complete. If there's any vulnerability, it would be in something Doyle has manufactured after the fact. Micah looked at the papers and then at her with an expression that was doing several things at once: gratitude and something warmer than gratitude, and the particular look of a man who is suddenly aware that a thing he had not expected is happening to him. You've been going through these, he said. I've been going through everything, she said. It's what I do. I like understanding how things fit together. She met his eyes. Doyle is bluffing. Or his lawyer is taking his money to pursue an action that has no real basis, because lawyers in Topeka are not cheap, and Doyle is going to expect results. The bluff will either collapse or escalate, and if it escalates, the documentation you have will hold. I'll write to Carmichael, Micah said. I already drafted the letter, she said. She slid a folded paper across the table. He picked it up and read it, and she watched his expression shift through something that she would later describe to herself as the moment when a door opens that you were not sure was a door. When he looked up from the letter, the warmth in his face was direct and undefended in a way she had not seen before. Lydia, he said. Yes, she said. I am not good at this, he said. I want to say that at the beginning so that whatever I do or don't say correctly in the next few minutes is understood in that context. All right, she said. Her heart was doing the same thing it had been doing more frequently over the past weeks. I had a dark time some years ago, he said, before I came to Kansas. I was 23 in Missouri, and I trusted someone I should not have trusted, and what I lost was not property or money, but the version of myself that believed things could be straightforward. I came west because I needed to be in a place where I could build things on my own terms. I built the ranch. I built a life that has been good and quiet and mine. He paused. I have not wanted to risk it. I have not wanted to put something I had built carefully into a position where it could be damaged by something I couldn't predict. She waited. She was very still. You are not something I can predict, he said. You are not a predictable person. You rode 240 miles alone to repay a debt you did not owe, which is either the bravest or the most stubborn thing I have encountered in my adult life. And I have a genuine admiration for both bravery and stubbornness, so it is difficult to know which I admire more. He met her eyes steadily. What I know is that this ranch has been mine for years, and it has felt full when it was empty, and now it is full, and the full is you, and I would very much like the full to continue. Lydia Barrett had a very well-trained composure. She had built it over years of situations that required her to function when functioning was hard, and she was proud of it in the way you are proud of tools you have made yourself. The composure was, at this precise moment, not functioning at full capacity. You are correct that you are not good at this, she said, and her voice came out with a slight quality that was not quite steadiness but was close. That was one of the most circuitous declarations I have ever received. I know, he said. I am sorry. Don't be, she said. She put her hand on the table, palm up, the way you extend a hand to something that frightens you slightly but that you want anyway. I would like the full to continue as well. His hand covered hers, and his hand was large and warm and work-rough, and she thought of Thomas's hands, which had been softer and quicker, and she thought that she was not comparing. She was just noticing that different people had different hands, and that was not a betrayal of anything. It was just the truth of a life that continued beyond the edges of what had come before. I'm also not moving quickly, she said, in case that was the question. "It wasn't," he said. "I didn't ask a question." "No, you didn't." She looked down at their hands. "You were very careful not to. I thought you should decide the pace." She looked up at him. "That is an extraordinarily thoughtful thing for a man to say." "I had some time to think about what I wanted to say." "How long?" He was quiet for a moment, and then he said, "Since approximately the second morning you were here." And she felt the corners of her mouth do something she could not fully control. It was not a hasty courtship, because neither of them was built for hasty things. What followed was 4 months of a careful, particular, entirely ordinary kind of falling in love. The kind that happens in kitchens and on porch steps, and on the backs of horses crossing the same prairie you have crossed 20 times before but find different this time because of who is riding beside you. He taught her to rope, badly, over 2 afternoons in the paddock, while Danny Rourke and the Hatch brothers found pressing business in the barn that required them to be occasionally visible from the paddock window. She was better at it than she expected to be on the second afternoon, and he said so with a pride that was slightly too warm for the subject of roping, and she filed that away. She read to him in the evenings when he was tired. He had a collection of books in the upstairs study that was larger than she would have guessed from his quietness, and they discovered a shared enthusiasm for history and a shared tolerance for long silences that made reading aloud together comfortable in the way only the most natural things are comfortable. She told him about her marriage honestly, and without either protection of Thomas's memory or unnecessary cruelty toward it. He listened the way he listened to everything, completely, without preparing his response while she was still talking. When she was done, he said, "You were kind to him," and she thought that was probably the truest summary anyone had ever made of her 3 years with Thomas Barrett. He told her about Missouri and the woman who had not been worth his trust. He did not name her, and Lydia did not ask for the name, because names were not the point. The point was the wound, which had been deep and had taken years to close, and the closeness of it had shaped him in ways that were both good and difficult, had made him careful where careless might have been easier, had made him private where open might have been more comfortable. "I think the careful was worth something," she said. "I think so too," he said. Now, the implication of now was not lost on either of them. Carmichael's response to the letter Lydia had drafted arrived in July, and it was better than they had hoped. The discrepancy Doyle's lawyer had claimed to find was, as Lydia had suspected, not in the original filing, but in a secondary document that had been submitted to the county record's office in 1878, apparently by someone who had either made an error or had deliberately introduced one. And Carmichael was quite direct in his opinion that introducing deliberately erroneous documents into county records was something that courts tended to view poorly, especially when the original, authentic documents were available for comparison. Doyle went quiet after that, which was not the same as gone, but was enough to breathe through. Martha Whitfield came to supper at the Ford Ranch in August, bringing Jacob and a jar of preserved peaches, and she sat at the supper table with Lydia and Micah and the 6 ranch hands and ate with the comfortable directness of a woman who felt at home anywhere she was welcomed, and afterward she sat with Lydia on the porch and said, "He's different with you." "He's the same person," Lydia said. "He's the same person with a window open," Martha said. "That's different." She looked out at the ranch yard, where Micah was crossing toward the barn to check the horses before bed, moving through the August dark with the ease of a man in his own country. "He's been alone a long time, not unhappy, but alone. There's a difference between those things that people don't always account for." "I know," Lydia said. "I think you do," Martha said. Micah asked her to marry him in September, on a morning in early autumn when the trees in the creek bottom had gone yellow and the air had that particular quality of plains autumn that is somehow both melancholy and hopeful, the way ends of things can also be beginnings. He did not make a ceremony of it, because neither of them was a ceremony person. He said, standing in the kitchen with his coffee in his hand, "I would like to marry you, Lydia." I would like you to stay, not as the housekeeper and not because of any debt or duty, but because this is your home and I want it to be your home and I want you to be my wife." She looked at him for a long moment. "You're still not very good at declarations," she said. "I know," he said. "Is the answer yes anyway?" "Yes," she said. "The answer is yes anyway." He crossed the kitchen and kissed her for the first time, which was not elaborate either, but which was the most honest thing she had felt in a very long time, and she kissed him back with all of the things she had been careful about for 4 months, and it was sufficient. More than sufficient. It was exactly right. They were married in October by the parson's minister, a slightly disheveled man named Reverend Aldgate, who performed the ceremony with genuine warmth in the small white church on the edge of town. Lydia wore a dark green dress she had made herself from fabric she had ordered from the general store in Parsons, and it was not white because she was not a young woman in her first marriage, and she saw no reason to pretend otherwise. And Micah looked at her in the green dress with an expression that she kept for the rest of her life in the part of her memory where she kept the things she returned to when she needed them. Martha Whitfield and Jacob attended. Pete Garza stood with Micah. Young Danny Rourke cried briefly and then looked mortified about it, and the Hatch brothers pretended not to notice, which was generous. Amos shook Micah's hand after the ceremony with both of his and said nothing, which was the equivalent, from Amos, of a speech. Afterward they had supper at the ranch, all of them together, and the table was full and loud in a way it had not been before, and Lydia sat at the table that had been Micah's, and was now also hers and felt, for the first time in a very long time, precisely located in her own life. The months that followed were the kind of months that do not make good stories because they were simply good. The ranch prospered through an excellent autumn sale of cattle. Lydia took over the accounts completely, which freed Micah from the bookkeeping he had always found draining, and she found in the process of managing a profitable operation a use for the mathematical and organizational instincts that had been looking for appropriate employment since Cincinnati. She also continued to correspond with Dr. Haller in Caldwell, who sent her medical journals and texts, and she established a small stock of pharmaceutical supplies in the ranch's storage room for the benefit of the hands, and increasingly, for neighboring families who found it easier to ride to the Ford ranch than to get to Parsons. Micah watched this development with unambiguous pride and a particular expression he had when she was doing something that delighted him, which was one of her favorite expressions in his repertoire. In November, she discovered she was pregnant. She told him in the kitchen, which was where they told each other most things, and he sat very still for a moment and then stood and held her carefully, which was different from how he usually held her, more deliberate, more intentional, as if he were conscious of something new. "Are you frightened?" he asked. "Of course," she said, honest as always, and pleased, both at the same time. "Good," he said. "I think both at the same time is correct." He wrote to his sister in Denver, a woman named Hannah, who replied within 2 weeks with a letter so long and enthusiastic that Lydia read it in installments and liked her enormously without having met her. Hannah Ford was, it turned out, a woman of firm opinions and great warmth, both of which were apparently characteristic of the Ford family, though she had expressed them differently than her brother. The winter of 1883 into 1884 was hard in the way Kansas winters were hard, which was comprehensively, with cold that came from every direction and wind that had been gathering momentum from the Arctic, and had not been interrupted by anything significant since starting. The ranch battened down in the way well-prepared operations did. Provisions stored, cattle handled with extra care, the house kept warm with the cast iron stove, and a fireplace in the front room that Micah kept supplied with wood so reliably that Lydia never found it empty. Harlan Doyle tried one more time in December, sending a lawyer's letter that was considerably less confident than his summer threats, the legal case having failed to materialize in any form that would survive scrutiny. Lydia drafted the response herself, consulting briefly with Carmichael by letter, And the response was clear and documented and final in a way that apparently communicated something important to Doyle, because they did not hear from him again that winter. And when they heard about him the following spring, it was through Pete Garza, who reported that Doyle had sold his operation and was rumored to be relocating to Texas, which was large enough to absorb men like Doyle without too much damage to any specific location. "Is it wrong to be relieved," Lydia said, "that he's someone else's problem now?" "No," Micah said. "It's practical." She laughed, and he watched her laugh with his particular expression, and she thought, this is what happiness looks like when it has been earned. Not the happiness of people who have never had reason to be unhappy, which is a kind of happiness that doesn't know what it is because it has nothing to compare itself to. The kind she and Micah had was the kind you recognize because you remember the absence of it, and the recognition makes it sweeter than it would have been otherwise. Their son was born in June of 1884. The birth was long and not without difficulty, and Dr. Haller, who Micah had insisted on telegraphing to come from Caldwell, arrived in time to be present and reassuringly competent throughout, which Lydia appreciated more than she could adequately express when the whole thing was behind her. Martha Whitfield was also there, because Micah had ridden for her the moment it was clear the birth was beginning, and Martha was exactly the kind of woman you wanted in a room during an event that required steady practical competence without excessive drama. When it was over and Lydia was holding the baby, she looked at Micah, who was standing by the window of their bedroom with an expression she had never seen on a human face before, which was the expression of a man who has just understood something so large that there is not yet language for it. "Come here," she said. He came to the bed and she held the baby out to him, and he took the baby with hands that were very careful, much more careful than she had ever seen him be with anything, which was saying something given that those hands could handle frightened cattle and green horses and power saws without any particular delicacy. "He looks like you," Micah said. "He's 3 hours old," Lydia said. "He looks like a person who has had a very difficult morning." "He has your eyes," Micah said with conviction, looking at a baby whose eyes were currently closed. "Micah," she said. "Yes." "What is his name?" They had discussed names. They had not decided. She had felt privately that the name needed to wait until she saw the baby, which was not a position she could easily explain but which Micah had accepted without needing the explanation. "William," she said. "For my father, if you're willing." Micah looked at the baby in his arms and then at her with eyes that were doing several things at once, warmth and pride, and something old and grateful. "William Ford," he said. "Yes." The following years were full in every sense of the word. William grew from an infant who observed everything with large, serious eyes to a toddler who investigated everything with the thoroughness of a small but determined scientist, and then to a child who followed his father around the ranch with a focused attention that Micah met with an inexhaustible patience and a willingness to explain things that Lydia found beautiful to watch. Hannah Ford visited from Denver in the summer of 1885 and stayed for 3 weeks, and everything Lydia had inferred from Hannah's letters was confirmed in person. She was warm and sharp and direct, and she argued with things she could just accept, which was exactly what Micah had said about Lydia, and the two women recognized each other on sight with the quick comprehension of people who are the same kind of difficult, incompatible ways. Hannah took one look at the ranch and one look at Micah and one look at Lydia and said, "He's different. Better, you did that." "He did it himself," Lydia said. "He was always this person. He just needed somewhere to be it fully." "That's the diplomatic answer," Hannah said. "It's also the true one," Lydia said. Hannah considered this and then nodded, satisfied, and that was that. The pharmaceutical work expanded organically over the following years, as Lydia's reputation in the area as someone who knew what to do for a fever or a wound or a difficult childbirth spread through the kind of informal network that operates in rural communities. Someone mentioned it to someone who told someone else. By 1886, she was receiving 3 or 4 requests a month from families within riding distance, and Dr. Haller, who visited annually and kept up a steady correspondence, had supplied her with a more comprehensive reference library and had begun sending her specific texts on obstetrics and pharmaceutical chemistry that treated her intelligence as a given. "You should formalize this somehow," Micah said one evening in the fall of 1886. William was 3 and asleep upstairs, and they were at the kitchen table, which remained their preferred location for important conversations. The medical work. "There must be a way. The Territorial Medical Licensing Board does not currently license women," she said. "That is a fact about the present," he said. "Not the future." She looked at him. "You sound very certain." "I am." He leaned forward slightly. "I've been reading. There are women being licensed in other territories. There are women in medical schools. It won't be this way forever, and when it changes, you should be ready." "I am always ready," she said with a slight smile. "I know," he said. "That's why I said it." He ordered her additional texts the following month. She received a certificate of competency from Dr. Haller, which was not a license but was documentation, and she framed it and hung it in the small room off the kitchen that had gradually transformed from a guest room into a proper dispensary, stocked with the pharmaceutical supplies that she ordered from Kansas City with an annual budget Micah had established without making a ceremony of it, the way he did things. In the spring of 1887, she found that she was pregnant again. This time she told him at supper simply, because they were 4 years into a marriage that had made the important things simple by accumulating enough shared understanding that most things could be said plainly. He looked at her for a moment and then said, "Is Dr. Haller available in November?" "I'll write to him this week," she said. "Good." He reached across the supper table and covered her hand with his. "Good." Their daughter arrived in November of 1887, which proved that Dr. Haller's estimate of October had been slightly optimistic. She was, unlike William, immediately and loudly present in a way that announced her personality before she was 20 minutes old. They named her Eleanor, which had been Micah's mother's name, and she had her father's dark eyes and her mother's jaw, and the disposition, apparent from early on, of someone who intended to be understood even when she had limited vocabulary with which to make herself clear. Martha Whitfield held Eleanor at 4 days old and said she was going to be formidable. "All the Ford women are going to be formidable," Lydia said. "I see you have adopted the plural," Martha said. "I have been a Ford for 4 years," Lydia said. "I think I've earned the plural." Martha laughed, which was, Lydia had come to know, the highest expression of Martha's approval. The ranch continued to grow and prosper through the late 1880s in a way that was built on solid management rather than luck, which meant it was more durable than the operations around it that depended on market conditions they couldn't control. Micah expanded carefully, adding pasture, improving the breeding stock, developing a reputation at the Abilene cattle market for animals that were consistently sound and well-finished. Pete Garza had been with him long enough that the operation of the ranch was as much Pete's expertise as Micah's, and Micah trusted Pete with a completeness that was based on 12 years of accumulated evidence. Danny Rourke grew up, over this period, from a 19-year-old who blushed when addressed directly into a competent young man of 26, who had learned to rope and ride with genuine skill, and who had lost the persistent blush without losing the fundamental decency that had always been underneath it. He met a young woman in Parsons named Agnes who worked in the dry goods store, and he courted her with a cautious seriousness that made Lydia think of the way careful people love, which is often less visible than other kinds but no less deep. They married in 1888, and Lydia made the wedding cake herself, and cried at the ceremony in a way she would have found entirely predictable if she had been able to predict anything about how much she would come to love the people on this ranch and in this valley. William started school in Parsons in the fall of 1889, which was the year Kansas achieved statehood, a transition that was marked in Parsons with considerable civic enthusiasm, and a parade that Eleanor, 2 years old, watched from her father's shoulders with an expression of imperial interest. William walked into school on his first morning with his mother's directness and his father's composure, and when he came home that afternoon Lydia asked him what he had learned and he said, "Lots of things," which was, she thought, an extremely satisfying answer from a 5-year-old. She did not stop doing the pharmaceutical and medical work. If anything, the establishment of Kansas as a state in 1890 brought with it new civic structures and new possibilities, and Lydia began to correspond with women's medical associations in Kansas City and Topeka, who were working toward formal recognition of women in the medical professions. She was not impatient about it. She had learned, over the years in the Kansas Territory, and then the new state, that the important changes came to people who prepared for them rather than waiting for them. And so, she continued to learn and to document and to build the body of knowledge and practice that would eventually be relevant to whatever structures became available. Micah supported this in the way he supported everything she did, which was by making it practical. He built her a proper dispensary room that spring, attached to the house. With good light from 2 windows and shelving, he designed himself and a work table at exactly the right height for someone of her particular standing measurement. She did not ask him to do this. He simply did it, and when she saw it for the first time, she stood in the doorway and looked at the room, at the good light and the careful shelving and the work table, and she understood again, as she had understood many times, that love is most accurately expressed in what people do with their time and attention. "Micah," she said, he was standing behind her. "Yes. This is perfect." "Good," he said simply. She turned and kissed him, which she did without any of the hesitation that had characterized the early months, because 4 years of marriage to a man who meant what he said had cured her of the habit of holding good things at arm's length. The summer of 1890 brought Hannah back from Denver for another visit, this time for a month, and William attached himself to his aunt with the thoroughness of a child who had identified a particularly interesting adult, and a leaner followed William wherever he went. So Hannah spent a month trailing 2 small people who were respectively serious and relentless, and she reported that she had never been more entertained in her life. On the last evening of Hannah's visit, the 4 adults sat on the porch, which had been extended along the full front of the house in a renovation Micah had completed the previous autumn, and the evening was warm and the stars were out and William and Alina were asleep inside. "I want to tell you something," Hannah said, "and I want to say it properly, so please don't be typical about it." She looked at Micah. "When you came west in 1875, you were so angry. Do you remember that? You were so angry about Missouri and about everything that had happened, and you were so determined to go somewhere you could build something by yourself that didn't depend on anyone, and you built it, and that was right and good, and I was proud of you." She paused. "But you were going to run that ranch alone until you died and tell yourself that was enough. And it might have been, but it wasn't what you deserved." Micah was very still in the way he was still when something important was being said. "What you deserved was this," Hannah said, and gestured at the porch and the house and, by implication, everything inside it and beyond it. "The full version, and I'm glad you have it." There was a silence. "I know," Micah said quietly. He looked at Lydia. "I know." Lydia looked back at him, and in the lamplight from the house his face was the face she had come to know so completely that she could read the full text of him at a glance, the steadiness and the warmth and the old careful discipline, and underneath all of it, the genuine depth of what he felt, which he still expressed mostly through actions rather than words, and which she understood completely. "I am glad too," she said. "In case that needed saying." "It didn't," he said, "but thank you for saying it." Hannah sighed in a way that conveyed that living around people who were naturally understated required a certain patience, and poured herself another cup of coffee from the pot on the porch railing. In the autumn of 1891, Jacob Whitfield, who had been 16 when Lydia first met him and was now 23, came to Micah and said he had an idea for improving the water management in the creek bottom that would benefit both the Ford Ranch and his mother's homestead, And did Micah have time to talk through it? Micah had time, and the idea was good, and they spent 3 weekends that October building a system of small earthen berms and channels in the creek bottom that improved water access to the Whitfield property significantly, and had the secondary effect of reducing erosion on the Ford Ranch's northeast fence line. Jacob worked with a focused competence that Micah admired and told him so directly. And Jacob, who was more comfortable with praise now at 23 than he had been at 15, received this with a straightforward nod. Lydia watched this exchange from the fence line and thought about the quiet network of mutual support that had built up around this ranch and this family over the years. Martha Whitfield and Jacob, Pete Garza and his crew, Danny Rourke and Agnes and their new baby, Hannah in Denver who wrote monthly without fail, and the web of neighboring families and the people in Parsons who had become known quantities in the way communities build known quantities over time. The isolation that she had feared as a young woman alone in the Kansas territory had not materialized, because isolation, she had come to understand, was not primarily a function of geography, but of whether you chose to be in relationship with the people around you, and they had chosen. She thought about Thomas Barrett, who had borrowed $340 from a man he had grown up with and had not managed to repay it, and whose death had set in motion the chain of events that had brought her to this porch and this life. She thought about this without bitterness and without undue sentimentality, because the truth of Thomas was complicated, and his love for her had been real even if his discipline had been inadequate, and his dying fear for her had been the last honest thing he had done, riding out to the Ford Ranch in September of 1882 to confess that he had not done right by his wife and to ask for more time. She thought about a boy named Micah Ford from Laclede County, Missouri, who had been 12 years old when his father died and who had watched neighbors help his family with a quiet grace that he had spent his entire adult life trying to replicate, who had built a ranch by himself and kept the loneliness at arm's length through work and purpose, who had forgiven a debt because it was right and not because anyone was watching, who had written a letter to a woman he had never met to tell her she was free of what her husband had left behind. She thought about the letter that had never arrived. She thought about a woman who had ridden 240 miles alone to repay a debt she had not owed, and had arrived at a ranch she did not know, and had walked into a kitchen she had never seen, and had found, entirely without planning for it, the thing she had been looking for since before she had had language for what she was looking for. She thought, I came here to settle a debt and I found a home, and I found a man who already knew it was settled, and everything that came after was built on the ground between the debt he forgave and the woman who refused to accept forgiveness without earning it. She thought this was probably the truest version of the story. On a morning in October of 1891, Lydia stood in the dispensary room with its good light and its careful shelving, and looked through the window at the Ford Ranch, her ranch, at the yard and the barn and the pasture beyond it where William, 7 years old, was learning from Pete Garza how to move cattle without frightening them, which required patience and a particular stillness that the boy was developing. Eleanor, 4, was in the kitchen with her father because she had decided that morning that she wanted to help make biscuits, which was proceeding with the systematic enthusiasm that characterized Eleanor's approach to most activities. From the kitchen, she could hear Eleanor asking a question. She could hear Micah answer it, his voice low and patient, and Eleanor ask a follow-up question, and Micah answer that too, and the particular quality of the morning light in October was golden and long and clear, and the ranch was alive around her with all its sounds, and Lydia Barrett, who was Lydia Ford, who had arrived in Kansas territory 15 years ago as a frightened young woman from Cincinnati with a dying father and a limited plan, stood in the room built for her by the man she loved and felt. In the fullest possible sense of the word home, she would write to Dr. Haller this week about a new medical text she had been waiting for. She would finish the autumn accounts this weekend, which showed the best year the ranch had had since they had expanded the pasture in 1888. She would take William and Alina to see Martha Whitfield on Sunday, as they did most Sundays, and she would bring the preserved tomatoes she had put up in September, and Martha would have the good bread she made on Saturday evenings. She would go into the kitchen now and see how the biscuits were proceeding, and the morning would become the afternoon and the afternoon the evening, and Micah would come in from whatever the day had required of him, and they would sit at supper with their children, and whoever else was at the table. And afterward she and Micah would sit on the porch in the October cool and talk about nothing in particular, which was always everything. She turned from the window and went to the kitchen door and opened it. "How are the biscuits?" she asked. Alina turned from the work table with flour on both hands and her father's dark eyes very bright. "Good," she said, with absolute confidence. "Papa says they're going to be perfect." Micah looked at Lydia over Alina's head with the expression she kept in the part of her memory where she kept the most important things, and his eyes said, clearly, everything he had spent 8 years learning to let her know. "They will be," Lydia said. She came into the kitchen and closed the door behind her, and the October morning went on around them, and the ranch was full and warm and entirely, completely theirs.